Have you ever wondered what happens when arrogance collides with innocence? When a man who has everything, wealth, status, respect, still feels the need to silence the one voice in his house that carries true warmth? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to hear might surprise you and maybe even remind you of something you've lived yourself. In the heart of Boston, in a mansion that seemed untouchable, Richard Collins sat at the head of his dinner table. Richard was not just another successful businessman. He was the kind of man whose name carried weight in the city. His words were rarely questioned, his decisions often final, and his pride larger than the mansion he lived in. That night, as crystal glasses reflected the glow of the chandelier, Richard's arrogance found a new target, his maid. Her name was Mary. To the guests at the table, she was invisible, someone who moved quietly, placing plates, refilling glasses, making sure everything remained perfect. But to one person in the room, she wasn't invisible at all. Richard's 8-year-old son, Ethan, looked at her not as a servant, but as a friend, a gentle soul who filled his lonely days with stories, kindness, and comfort. Still, Richard couldn't stand the idea of his son giving more attention to Mary than to him. So when Ethan, curious and full of innocence, asked Mary a simple question during dinner, Richard's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Stay silent," he ordered her, his tone sharp, enough to make the entire room fall quiet. To him, her place was to serve, not to speak. Have you ever been through this, where someone tried to erase your presence as if your words carried no value at all? That sting of humiliation is something that can linger for years. But here's where the story takes a turn. What Richard didn't know is that his attempt to silence Mary would not only wound her pride, but also expose his own weakness, because in that very moment, his young son was watching closely, absorbing everything. And children, innocent as they are, often become mirrors that reflect the truth we try to hide. Ethan's small voice carried more weight than Richard's booming authority. He didn't raise it out of anger or rebellion, but out of an undeniable need for connection. The boy had spent countless nights listening to Mary's stories, finding in her voice the tenderness his father never offered. And so, in front of everyone, Ethan made a request that would turn the evening upside down. "Dad," he said softly but firmly, "I don't want you to tell me a story tonight. I only want Mary to tell it." Can you imagine the silence that followed? The shock in the room as a child with pure innocence challenged the very authority his father built his life upon. Richard, the man who thought he could control every detail, suddenly faced a truth he couldn't silence. And this is where the heart of the story lies. Not in the clash of wealth and poverty, but in the undeniable force of honesty, love, and dignity breaking through walls of arrogance. What you're about to discover next may surprise you, because sometimes the most powerful lessons don't come from boardrooms, bank accounts, or high society gatherings. They come from the quiet voice we try to dismiss, and from the courage of a child who dares to speak what everyone else is too afraid to say. And in that Boston mansion, under the weight of chandeliers and pride, a story began that would forever change the meaning of respect, love, and power. Maybe you've already witnessed something like this yourself, a moment when a voice was silenced simply because it came from someone society labels as less important. And maybe, deep down, you remember how much that moment hurt, or how much you wished someone had stood up and said something. If this story is stirring something inside you, share it with me in the comments below. I'd love to know your thoughts, your experiences, or even just how this scene makes you feel. Your voice here is not just welcome, it's what keeps this conversation alive. And while you're here, if this story is touching you in some way, don't forget to tap the like button. It may seem like a small gesture, but it's what helps this channel reach more people who, just like you, are looking for stories that carry meaning and emotion. Every like, every comment, it's not just interaction, it's a way of building a community where respect, dignity, and humanity have a place to breathe. If You want to keep walking with me through stories like this, where arrogance meets humility and where unexpected lessons shine through. Subscribing is the best way to stay connected. Think of it as a seat saved at this very table, where every week we uncover another moment that makes us reflect on life and the value of human connection. So stay close, because what comes next in this story will dig even deeper into the heart of this mansion, and you'll see how one child's voice can shake the very foundation of pride. Richard Collins was the kind of man whose shadow lingered in every room he entered. People didn't just listen when he spoke. They adjusted their posture, lowered their voices, and tried not to meet his eyes for too long. In Boston's financial circles, his name was attached to skyscrapers, contracts, and decisions that could make or break entire companies overnight. At charity events, his smile was polished, his suit tailored, and his handshake firm enough to remind you where the power resided. But behind those walls of influence and money, there was another side of Richard, one that was rarely spoken about. At home, in that vast mansion filled with marble floors and portraits of ancestors who looked equally stern, his presence inspired not admiration, but fear. Richard believed deeply in appearances. For him, every moment of life was a stage, and he was the leading man who never forgot his role. He liked the way people leaned in when he talked about investments, the way waiters rushed to fill his glass, and the way neighbors whispered about his wealth. In his mind, money was not just a tool, it was proof of superiority. Every decision, every interaction carried the unspoken rule that wealth commanded respect. And if someone forgot that rule, Richard was quick to remind them. His obsession with control and order stretched into every corner of his life. The dining table was always set to perfection, the silver polished, the plates aligned. Guests who visited were carefully selected, and even the smallest detail, from the flowers in the hallway to the vintage wine served, was designed to project refinement. To Richard, the world was divided into those who managed, commanded, and succeeded, and those who followed, obeyed, and served. It wasn't cruelty in his mind, but simply the natural order of things. Yet for those who worked under his roof, the weight of that mindset was suffocating. The staff moved as if rehearsing a script where their lines were silence and their roles invisible. None felt that pressure more than Mary, the maid who had learned over the years to keep her eyes lowered and her words measured. But as much as Richard wanted her to remain just another quiet figure in the background, her presence in his home carried an unexpected impact, one he refused to acknowledge. Because while Richard's life was about numbers, deals, and carefully constructed appearances, Mary's was about humanity. She wasn't just a maid, she was someone who noticed the small details that everyone else missed. Ethan's lonely glances at the window when his father was late again, the way the boy's smile widened when someone bothered to listen to him, the way he clutched his worn-out teddy bear at night as if it were his only source of comfort. And in those small gestures of kindness, Mary unknowingly began to step into a role far greater than the one Richard had written for her. Richard, however, was blind to all of this. To him, Ethan was not a child searching for warmth, but a future reflection of himself. He believed his son needed discipline, resilience, and above all, the mindset of a leader who wouldn't bow to anyone. Weakness, Richard often muttered under his breath, is the one thing you can't afford in this world. He thought he was preparing Ethan for success, when in reality, he was pushing him further into silence. The contrast between father and son was impossible to ignore. Richard's voice carried authority, sharp and unyielding. Ethan's was soft, uncertain, often drowned out by the sheer force of his father's presence. Yet inside the boy was something his father didn't have, the ability to connect, to see beyond appearances, to notice the hidden truths in people's eyes. And it was this very difference that would soon create the crack in Richard's perfectly built world. One evening, as the guests admired Richard's collection of art, a display of power and culture meant to impress, Ethan lingered by Mary's side. "Oh, why does Dad always sound so angry?" he whispered, his small fingers tugging at her sleeve. Mary, careful with her words, simply answered, "Sometimes people forget that kindness is stronger than anger." It was the kind of answer Richard would have dismissed as foolish, but for Ethan it planted a seed of thought. Richard walked into the room just in time to hear Ethan's question. His jaw tightened, his pride stung by the idea that his son would confide in a maid instead of him. "Ethan," Richard said firmly, "you'll learn that in this world, respect comes from strength, not softness." His words were final, delivered like a verdict, but Ethan didn't respond. He simply looked at Mary, as if her quiet presence offered a hidden truth his father couldn't see. It was in these small, almost invisible moments that the stage was being set for a revelation Richard never imagined. Because the journey of arrogance often blinds those who walk it. Richard was so consumed by the impact of appearances, the decisions that shaped his empire, and the image he guarded so carefully, that he missed the transformation happening in his own home. He didn't see that his son's silence wasn't agreement. It was distance. He didn't realize that the stories Mary told were not just entertainment, but lessons shaping Ethan's understanding of love, respect, and dignity. And so Richard kept playing his role. At business meetings, he was the confident leader. At home, he was the stern father. But behind the scenes, the balance of power was quietly shifting. Not in the boardroom, but in the living room, where a boy chose to sit closer to a maid than to his own father. This was the hidden truth Richard couldn't admit to himself. His wealth commanded attention, but it didn't inspire affection. His authority created order, but not loyalty. And the very thing he dismissed, the voice of someone he believed to be beneath him, was becoming the most important influence in his son's life. The mansion in Boston may have looked like a fortress of power, but within its walls, a quiet transformation was taking place, and the moment when it would all be revealed was drawing closer, as Richard's obsession with control collided head-on with the innocence of a child and the dignity of a woman who had nothing to give but her humanity. Mary didn't come from wealth or influence. Her world had been built on long shifts, worn hands, and a resilience that only those who've known struggle can understand. She grew up in a modest neighborhood just outside of Boston, where neighbors shared sugar and stories over fences, and where laughter was often louder than money. Life had taught her to be resourceful, to appreciate small victories, and to hold on to patience, even when everything else seemed uncertain. She carried these lessons with her into the Collins mansion, a place so polished it felt like a different universe from the one she knew. Yet, even within those gleaming walls, she managed to keep her humanity intact, refusing to let the coldness of wealth extinguish her warmth. To Richard, she was just another name on the payroll, a figure moving silently in the background. But to Ethan, she was a source of comfort in a house that often felt more like a museum than a home. While Richard valued control and appearance, Mary valued connection. She noticed the small details others ignored, the way Ethan hesitated before speaking at the dinner table, the way his eyes searched for reassurance when his father's voice rose, the way he clutched his drawings like fragile treasures. She saw him not as an heir to a fortune, but as a child craving affection. Mary had an instinct for knowing when someone needed to be heard. She didn't force her presence. She offered it gently, like an open door. When Ethan came home from school with shoulders slumped, she didn't flood him with questions. Instead, she would sit nearby, folding laundry or polishing silver, waiting until he was ready. "Rough day?" she'd ask softly, and sometimes that was all it took for Ethan to spill his worries. Her kindness wasn't loud, but it was steady. It was in the way she remembered the stories he loved most, the way she turned ordinary objects into magical props for bedtime tales, the way she treated him not as someone destined for power, but as a boy who deserved love. Ethan once said to her, "You make this house feel less big." And in that simple confession, Mary understood the impact she had on him. Richard, however, couldn't see it. He mistook her patience for weakness, her humility for insignificance. "Don't encourage him with nonsense," he snapped once, overhearing her telling Ethan a story about a fisherman who found happiness in giving rather than keeping. To Richard, stories were a waste of time unless they carried lessons of ambition and conquest. But Ethan's eyes lit up at Mary's tales in a way they never did when his father lectured him about success. That contrast was the hidden truth Richard refused to face. His wealth might impress the world, but it did nothing to fill the emptiness inside his son. Mary often wondered how a man so powerful could be so blind. She didn't hate Richard. Pity was closer to the truth. She saw in him a man trapped by his own mindset, a man who believed control was the only path to respect. "He doesn't know any different," she whispered to herself once, while tucking Ethan into bed. "He's forgotten what it feels like to be small." Her words weren't bitter, just reflective, as if she understood that even arrogance has a story behind it. And yet her presence in that house was more disruptive to Richard's authority than he realized. Because behind the scenes, Mary was teaching Ethan a different way of looking at the world. Through her actions, she showed him that kindness had impact, that patience was not weakness, and that love could carry more strength than pride. These were quiet lessons, almost invisible, but they shaped the boy in ways that no lecture about ambition ever could. One afternoon, as autumn leaves scattered across the Collins estate, Ethan came running into the kitchen where Mary was preparing a simple snack. "Mary," he said, his voice filled with urgency, "Dad says I have to learn how to win, but do you think it's bad if I don't like winning all the time?" Mary paused, meeting his eyes. She didn't rush to answer. She placed the knife down, wiped her hands, and crouched to his level. "Winning isn't bad, Ethan," she said, gently. "But if winning means forgetting who you are, then it's not really winning at all." Her words carried more weight than she realized. To Ethan, they were a revelation, a new way of thinking that went against the rigid structure his father imposed. That moment planted in him the courage to question, to wonder if the decisions his father praised were the only ones worth making. Mary didn't set out to challenge Richard's authority, but the transformation in Ethan was becoming undeniable. Richard began to notice the shift. The boy who once sat quietly during dinners now asked questions that unsettled him. "Dad," Ethan asked one evening, "why do people respect money more than kindness?" Richard frowned, his fork clinking against the plate. "Because money builds the world you live in," he replied sternly, but Ethan didn't look convinced. His gaze slid toward Mary, who remained silent, though her soft expression told him everything he needed to know. This subtle defiance was not born from rebellion, but from discovery. Ethan was beginning to see the hidden truth of his father's empire, that power without compassion was hollow. And every day, Mary's quiet patience made that truth more vivid. She had no intention of taking the father's place, yet in Ethan's eyes, she had already filled the role Richard had abandoned, the role of someone who listened, someone who cared. The journey unfolding within the mansion was invisible to outsiders. Guests saw Richard's charm, his wealth, the perfection of his home. They didn't see the lonely boy searching for connection or the maid who became his anchor. But transformation rarely announces itself with grand gestures. It builds quietly through small decisions, small revelations, until one moment arrives that makes everything impossible to ignore. Mary felt it coming, though she couldn't say why. Perhaps it was in the way Ethan's questions grew bolder, or in the way Richard's irritation deepened whenever his son chose her, company over his. She knew that the balance of power inside the house was fragile, that every gesture carried weight. And as she folded Ethan's drawings one night, scribbles of castles, knights, and smiling figures who looked suspiciously like her, she couldn't help but wonder how long Richard's authority could stand against the simple strength of a child's love. The Collins mansion remained a place of grandeur, but beneath the polished surface, something was shifting. The roles Richard had, written so carefully, Powerful father, obedient son, invisible maid, were starting to blur. And as the days passed, the tension between appearances and reality tightened, waiting for the inevitable moment when it would finally break. Ethan's world, despite being surrounded by rare paintings and echoing hallways, felt strangely small. His days unfolded within rooms so carefully arranged that nothing seemed to belong to a child. The piano in the parlor was always closed, the billiard table never used, and the library smelled of leather-bound books that no one actually read to him. If you looked closely, you would find the trail of a boy trying to make a vast place feel human. A lost crayon under a velvet chair, a paper airplane hidden behind a heavy curtain, a small footprint on the edge of a polished step. He liked the sunlight that landed on the staircase around 10 in the morning because it made the dust sparkle, proof that even in a perfect mansion, something free still moved. His loneliness wasn't the loud kind that throws tantrums. It was a quiet ache that learned to wait, for laughter, for softness, for someone to ask a question and really listen to the answer. Mary noticed the waiting before Ethan knew how to name it. She had a way of being present without pressing herself into the center, like a gentle outline that made space for someone else's feelings to breathe. When he wandered into the kitchen after school, she didn't flood him with cheerfulness or advice. She poured him water, placed an apple on a plate, and asked, "Want me to slice it or whole?" He would always say, "Slices," as if the act of turning something whole into pieces made it easier to swallow the day. Sometimes he'd add, almost as an afterthought, "Can you leave the middle part? I like the seeds." Mary never asked why. She simply saved the core and wrapped it in napkin, as though the seeds contained a promise he would need later. Bedtime became their quiet ritual, a behind-the-scenes rhythm that no guest ever saw. If Richard stayed late at the office, the house felt freer. Ethan would change into pajamas printed with tiny stars and carry his teddy bear, its fur thinned by affection, into the room that overlooked the garden. "Will you read The Fisherman's Story?" he'd ask, though sometimes he requested a new one that hadn't been written yet. Mary would sit at the edge of the bed, smoothing the blanket in small circles, and begin with a line that seemed to open a door. Once there was a lighthouse keeper who measured the night by how many people he kept safe, she'd say. Or, once there was a girl who discovered that kindness is a map. Ethan listened like a traveler who'd finally found directions. "What happened next?" he'd whisper, inching closer to the sound of her voice. "He changed his mind," Mary would answer, "because sometimes the bravest decisions are the ones that make you softer." Those words tucked themselves into Ethan's mindset more securely than any lecture. About success, the boy returned the favor with trust, the kind that chooses its guardian carefully. He told Mary things he never said to his father because her silence held space, not judgment. One afternoon he stood in the doorway as she folded freshly dried towels. "Do you think people can be different at work than at home?" he asked. Mary looked up, understanding he wasn't asking about people in general. "I think people want to be seen as strong," she said gently, "but what they need is permission to be honest." He nodded, twisting a towel's edge in his fingers. "Sometimes I want Dad to laugh," he admitted, "like really laugh, not the kind he does at meetings." She tucked a towel into the stack and said, "Real laughter can't be scheduled. It shows up when your heart trusts the room." Even the house seemed to learn their patterns. The corridor lights dimmed a little earlier, the clocks sounded softer, and the doorknobs turned with less protest when Ethan went looking for Mary. After a nightmare, he would stand by the kitchen doorway, hair ruffled, pillow mark on his cheek. "I dreamed I was at the top of the stairs and it went on forever," he'd say. "I couldn't find the bottom." Mary would pour warm milk and say, "Some dreams are just long hallways. They end when you remember a door." He would yawn, releasing the last of his fear. "Then tell me a door," he'd plead, and she'd answer with a story that wasn't just a story, a small key shaped like empathy. Their bond was built in increments, A repaired toy soldier, a found marble, a secret stash of pastel chalk for the slate board hidden behind the study desk. "Don't tell," Ethan would say, eyes bright. "I won't," Mary would promise. And the promise mattered, because she kept it. He drew a rocket landing on the moon and added a stick figure with curly lines for hair. "That's you," he grinned. "You helped me land." The chalk dust clung to his fingers like proof of a revelation, the kind that changes how a child understands safety. It wasn't that Ethan didn't love his father. He did in the way children love the mountains they can't climb. Distant, impressive, a little scary. When Richard came home early, the atmosphere shifted like weather. The bedtime stories became shorter or paused altogether, and Ethan's questions folded into his chest. He wanted to show his father the chalkboard, the rocket, the tiny figure labelled with an M, but the timing never felt right. Richard's pace was always 2 steps ahead, already late for tomorrow. "Dad," Ethan tried one evening, standing in the doorway to the study, "do you want to see my drawing?" Richard barely looked up from the glowing spreadsheet. "Later, buddy," he said, voice clipped. "I've got something important here." Ethan lingered. "Is it more important than a rocket?" A flicker crossed Richard's face, quickly disguised as efficiency. "It's different," he replied, and the moment closed like a book snapped shut. Mary saw the impact of those small closures. She didn't criticize Richard, but she worked around the gaps. When Ethan couldn't sleep, she'd bring the sky closer. "You know the rocket doesn't work without fuel," she'd whisper. "Fuel is made of little things, breathing slow, telling the truth, noticing what feels heavy and what feels light." Ethan exhaled, a child's version of release. "Then I'm saving fuel," he decided. "Good," she smiled. "You'll need it for your journey." He liked that word. It made the future sound like something he could walk through at his own pace. On rainy Saturdays, Ethan often settled at the kitchen table while Mary prepared soup. The radio played softly, a sports recap in the background, America's ordinary soundtrack. He tore small squares of paper and arranged them like tiles. "I'm making a city," he announced. "What's its name?" Mary asked, stirring. He thought hard. "Haven," he decided. "It means a place you don't have to be big." She put down the spoon and looked at him fully, as if he had just revealed the hidden truth of a child's longing. "That's a good city," she said. "Every life needs one." Secrets, with Ethan, were gentle creatures. He shared them not to rebel, but because he trusted Mary with their edges. "I hid a note," he confessed one day, conspiratorial. "It's in the library, inside a book with a red cover." "What does it say?" she asked, lowering her voice accordingly. "It says, 'Please talk to me like I'm not in trouble.'" He didn't cry when he said it. The request was calm, almost practical, like someone finally labeling a drawer. Mary's hand paused on the countertop. "That's a strong note," she said quietly. "Sometimes the bravest letters are short." He also had questions that didn't fit neatly into the mansion's routine. "Why do grown-ups have meetings?" he wondered while stacking crackers into tiny towers. "To make decisions," Mary said. "But the best ones." He waited. "They make room," she answered. "For who?" "For people who aren't in the room yet." He considered that, toppling the cracker tower with a satisfied flick. "Then my meeting would invite you," he concluded, "and my teddy, and maybe the moon." She laughed, a soft, real sound that warmed the air. "That's a very complete team." There were moments when Ethan's innocence reframed the house in unexpected ways. He placed a sticker of a smiling sun on the corner of a priceless paintings frame. When the house manager scolded him later, he dragged his feet to the kitchen. "It was just a little sun," he murmured. "It doesn't hurt the past." Mary listened without rushing to fix it. "Maybe the past is only scared of bright things," she said, handing him a cloth to peel the sticker safely. "Let's give it another home." He pressed the sun onto the back of his closet door, where only he and Mary would see it. "Now it's ours," he decided, and the closet, in its humility, felt honored. At night, when the house grew serious again, Ethan sometimes asked for something more than a story. "Can you stay for one more minute?" he'd plead, catching the sleeve of her sweater. 1 more minute, she'd agree, and they both understood that 1 minute could carry the weight of an hour. Tell me something true, he'd add, bargaining with honesty. Mary thought for a breath and said, You don't have to become big to be brave. You just have to stay kind when it's easier not to. He lay there, eyes adjusting to the soft dark. Then I'm brave at school, he said, because I said hi to the new kid twice. The declaration, small and proud, filled the room with a victory that needed no applause. Ethan's attachment to Mary wasn't born from defiance. It grew out of recognition. In a mansion of curated gestures, her warmth was unscripted. In a home where outcomes mattered more than feelings, her presence made room for feelings to be outcomes. She didn't promise that the world was gentle. She promised that gentleness could make the world more possible. What if Dad gets mad? Ethan asked after a day of sharp words and quick footsteps. Then we breathe, Mary said, tapping a patient rhythm on the side of the bed. In for 4, out for 4. He inhaled obediently, counting. Again, she said, and together they created a tiny harbor against an adult storm. The transformation of a child is rarely dramatic from the outside. It's a quiet accumulation of safe moments. Ethan began to carry himself differently, not with swagger, but with steadiness. He wrote notes to himself. 3 words each, tucked under the lamp base. Listen more today. Ask kindly first. Stories help. These weren't instructions from a parent or a teacher. They were seeds he planted voluntarily, evidence of an inner compass aligning. Even his games changed. When he built towers of blocks, he made sure there was a ladder attached. In case someone needs to come down, he explained. Down is okay too. That subtle recalibration had impact beyond Ethan's room. At dinner, he asked guests questions, not to impress them, but to understand them. What made you happy when you were 8? He asked a lawyer who had forgotten how to talk without a brief. The man blinked, surprised into humanity, and said, Riding my bike with no hands. Ethan smiled. That's brave, he said simply, and the table for a moment released its armor. Mary watched from the service doorway, invisible by design, but present in effect. The boy's kindness didn't perform. It transformed. Of course, not every moment landed. Softly. There were days when Richard's impatience erased the room's oxygen. Ethan shrank then, the way a small animal holds still. Later, in the hall, he whispered to Mary, I didn't do anything wrong, but it feels like I did. She knelt to meet his eyes. That feeling doesn't belong to you, she said, offering him the sentence like a tool. You can set it down. He tested the idea physically, unclenching his fist, letting his shoulders drop. I dropped it, he announced. Good, she said. Leave it where it falls. Little by little, Ethan learned to name what he needed. Please tell me a short story, he would request on exhausted nights. The kind that ends with everyone getting home. Mary had one ready. A bus driver who waited an extra minute for a runner. A neighbor who kept the porch light on. A stray dog who found the gate open at just the right time. Everyone got home, she finished. Everyone? He double-checked. Everyone, she confirmed, and he fell asleep with relief. Arranged across his face like a warm blanket, there were also secrets Mary kept for him that didn't require hiding, only safeguarding. He had a jar of found objects, buttons, a subway token, a feather, a coin flattened by a train. This is my museum, he declared, cataloguing his treasures with solemn joy. What's the admission price? Mary teased. A story, he grinned. Every visitor has to tell one. She paid gladly, offering tales that honored the smallness of things, as if the universe itself leaned down to hear. In this private economy of tenderness, Ethan discovered that love is not a performance, but a practice. The mansion didn't change. The chandeliers still glittered, the meetings still overflowed, the schedule still clicked forward. But something essential was being rewritten in a child's heart. He understood, without yet having the words, that power measured by fear is brittle, while dignity measured by care is durable. You know, he whispered one evening as Mary straightened, the bookshelf. Sometimes I think stories are truer than the news. She turned, considering. Stories remind us what the news can forget, she said, that people are not just outcomes. They are journeys. The night that would bend all these threads into a single line began like any other. A late dinner, a chill in the air, the garden lights throwing their quiet geometry across the lawn. Ethan sat a little straighter than usual, as if bracing. Mary noticed the shift, the way children do before a test they didn't study for. She touched the back of his chair in passing, a brief signal, "You are seen." It wasn't a plan or a strategy, just a habit of care. And in that moment, the invisible city Ethan had built with paper squares and chalk and whispered promises felt ready for something it couldn't name yet, something that would ask the house to choose what mattered. The evening began with the kind of precision Richard Collins demanded from every part of his life. The dining room glowed under the weight of a chandelier that had once belonged to an old Boston family, its crystal catching the light in sharp edges. The table was set like a photograph, wine glasses aligned, cutlery gleaming, plates arranged in exact symmetry. To Richard, these details mattered not for their beauty, but for the message they sent. Perfection was proof of control, and control was the foundation of respect. Tonight, his colleagues and distant relatives had gathered for what he considered not simply a dinner, but a demonstration of his influence. Ethan, seated beside his father, felt the heaviness of the room before the first course was even served. He fidgeted with the napkin in his lap, his young mind sensing that every move was being watched, every sound measured. Across the table, executives in tailored suits spoke of markets, mergers, and decisions that could shift the city's landscape. Laughter rose when Richard delivered a story about closing a deal, though it wasn't the kind of laughter that came from joy. It was the laughter of compliance, of people agreeing because they must. Mary moved quietly along the edges of the room, her steps soft, her presence nearly erased by design. She had served countless dinners like this one, but each time the tension pressed against her shoulders in the same way. She knew how to refill glasses without drawing attention, how to clear plates with the efficiency of someone practiced at being invisible. Yet even in her silence, her eyes often found Ethan, and tonight Ethan looked more restless than usual. As conversations circled endlessly around profits and strategies, Ethan leaned sideways, tugging gently at Mary's sleeve when she came close. His voice, though low, carried the sincerity of a child seeking refuge. "Mary," he asked, "what's the best story you know about someone being brave?" It was an innocent question, born not from rebellion, but from longing. The boy wanted something real, something warm, in a room full of cold calculations. Mary's heart softened instantly. She glanced at him, then at the table, measuring the risk. And because she had always believed that children deserved answers, she began to respond. "There was once," but her words never made it past the first sentence. Richard's voice cut through the air, sharper than the silver at his table. "That's enough." The room stilled. He didn't shout, but the authority in his tone carried more force than volume. All eyes shifted to him as he set his glass. Down with deliberate calm. "Your place," he continued, his eyes fixed on Mary, "is to serve, not to speak." The silence that followed was louder than any outburst. The executives lowered their gazes, suddenly fascinated by their plates. Relatives shifted uncomfortably, their expressions tightening but not daring to intervene. For them, this was Richard's stage, and no one crossed the man who wrote the script. Mary froze. Her hands, still holding a water jug, trembled slightly before she steadied herself. She lowered her eyes, the reflex of someone used to enduring humiliation in silence. But her face, though calm, carried the faint shadow of hurt, an expression so fleeting that only Ethan caught it. The boy's small chest tightened. He looked at his father, then back at Mary. "But I asked her," he said softly, his voice nearly lost beneath the clink of a spoon against porcelain. "I wanted her to answer." Richard leaned toward him, his jaw tight, his pride bristling. "You don't need stories from the help," he declared, his words laced with disdain. "You have me for that." Ethan's eyes widened. For a moment he seemed caught between fear and courage. He wanted to argue, to push back, but the weight of his father's presence was heavy. Still, his silence wasn't the silence of agreement. It was the silence of a child calculating what mattered more, obedience or truth. The guests felt the tension, but kept their faces neutral. This was not their battle, and none of them wanted to risk being pulled into Richard's storm. Yet behind the polished surface of their restraint, thoughts churned. Some pitied Mary, others admired her quiet composure, and a few wondered if Richard's harshness revealed more about him than he intended. Mary, standing at the edge of the room, let the moment pass without defense. She knew better than to challenge a man who clung to authority like a lifeline. Still, something shifted inside her. She wasn't angry, not yet. Instead, she felt the familiar ache of injustice, the sting of being reminded that in some worlds, humanity was measured by wealth, not by heart. Ethan leaned closer to her as she served the next dish, whispering so only she could hear. "I still want the story," he insisted, his voice steady now, carrying a quiet defiance his father didn't notice. Mary glanced at him, and though she didn't speak, her eyes promised that the story would find its way to him. If not now, then later, when the walls no longer listened. The meal continued, though its rhythm was broken. The conversations, once smooth and performative, now carried an edge. Richard tried to regain control, telling another tale of victory in business, but the charm was thinner than before. The guests smiled, but the memory of his command lingered in the room like smoke. What Richard couldn't see was the impact of that moment. He believed he had reinforced order, that he had reminded both Mary and his son of their places, but the hidden truth was different. In silencing Mary, he revealed his own insecurity. In shaming her, he lost something far more valuable than authority. He lost his son's silent trust. Ethan, though small, understood more than Richard gave him credit for. He saw the way his father's words wounded, the way they turned kindness into a target. And in that recognition, something in Ethan's mindset shifted. He began to question not just his father's rules, but the meaning of respect itself. The night moved forward, courses arriving, and plates being cleared, but the air never fully recovered. Mary's hands remained steady, her movements precise, but the weight of humiliation lingered like an invisible bruise. She carried on because that's what survival demanded, but within her silence lived a strength Richard could not measure. As the final dish was served and glasses clinked in shallow toasts, Ethan sat quietly, his thoughts louder than the chatter around him. He didn't know how yet, but he felt the need to make a decision. Something inside him whispered that Mary's voice mattered more than the cold authority that had just tried to erase it. And when children begin to see the cracks in a parent's power, the story rarely unfolds the way that parent expects. The mansion's lights burned bright against the dark Boston sky, projecting the image of success to anyone passing on the street. But inside, beneath the polished silver and careful order, a subtle transformation was taking place. Ethan's journey was no longer about obedience. It was about discovery. And Mary, though silenced in front of the guests, had already become the voice that would guide him through the hidden truths his father refused to face. The dinner table still carried the echo of Richard's rebuke. Conversation had resumed, but it wasn't the same. Words skimmed the surface, strained and cautious, as though every guest was careful not to stir the memory of what had just unfolded. Mary moved with her usual grace, but behind her, silence. Ethan felt the tremor of something unresolved. He couldn't forget the way his father's voice had cracked like a whip, cutting through her attempt at kindness. For a child, injustice doesn't always register in the language of politics or power. It appears as a simple wrongness, something felt more than understood. And Ethan, only 8 years old, could feel the wrongness settle into his chest like a weight. The plates shifted from one course to the next, silverware clinking in a rhythm that almost masked his quiet fidgeting. His small fingers drummed against the polished wood, then stilled as he gathered courage. He looked at Mary, her eyes downcast as she refilled glasses, and then at his father, who leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man convinced the evening was once again under his control. That contrast became unbearable to Ethan. He realized, perhaps without even naming it, that someone had to say what he was thinking, and so he did. "Dad," Ethan began, his voice soft but steady, drawing attention more by its innocence than by its volume. A few guests glanced toward him, curious, expecting a child's interruption, something harmless, easy to dismiss. But the words that followed did not belong to a script anyone in that room had written. "I don't want you to tell me a story tonight," he said, looking directly at his father. The sentence was simple, but the meaning hit like a crack across the polished surface of Richard's authority. Forks paused in mid-air, glasses hovered, eyes widened. Ethan didn't falter. "I only want Mary to tell it." The room froze. For a moment, it was as if even the chandelier's light dimmed, bending under the weight of the boy's request. Richard's face hardened, his expression caught between disbelief and anger. His son had just pierced the very authority he had spent years cementing, not in private, but in front of colleagues, family, and people whose respect he relied on. One of the executives cleared his throat, uncomfortably, trying to dissolve the silence with a sip of wine. Richard's mother-in-law shifted in her seat, her eyes flickering with something dangerously close to approval for her grandson's honesty. But no one dared speak. The moment belonged to Ethan. Mary froze in place, the tray in her hands suddenly heavy. Her breath caught as she processed the words. She hadn't expected this, hadn't imagined the child would take her side so openly. She looked at Ethan, her eyes wide, silently begging him to be careful, but in his small frame she saw no fear, only a quiet conviction that reminded her of the stories she used to hear as a girl, stories where truth, no matter how small, cracked open walls of pride. Richard leaned forward, his chair creaking as if the wood itself braced for his reaction. "What did you just say?" His voice was low, controlled, but sharp enough to make a guest at the far end of the table stiffen. Ethan didn't look away. His hands trembled slightly in his lap, but his gaze held. "I only want Mary's story," he repeated, his tone firmer this time. He didn't shout, he didn't plead, he simply declared. And in the honesty of that declaration, the balance of the room shifted. Richard's jaw tightened. He could feel the eyes of his guests pressing against him, watching to see how the great Richard Collins would respond to being defied, not by a rival, not by an associate, but by his own son. The air was thick with expectation, and beneath it, humiliation crept in. He had silenced Mary to protect his image, only to have his son undo the performance in a single breath. "Ethan," Richard said, his tone laced with authority, "this is not the time." But the boy shook his head. "It's always the time for a story," he answered softly. "Her stories make me feel safe. Yours don't." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples no one could ignore. A gasp escaped from one of the women seated near the end of the table, quickly covered by the clink of her glass. Mary lowered her head, her cheeks burning, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to protect Ethan, to shield him from the wrath she knew would come, but she also knew there was no way to undo what had been said. Richard's eyes darkened, his pride warring with his composure. He was a man accustomed to control, to every decision bending in his favor. Yet here, in front of an audience, his own child had made a decision he could not reverse. He could punish Ethan later, behind closed doors, but he couldn't erase the truth that had just unfolded in public. And the truth was this: his son trusted the maid more than he trusted his father. The guests shifted uncomfortably, torn between loyalty to Richard and admiration for the boy's courage. A few glanced at Mary, perhaps seeing her for the first time not as a servant, but as someone who carried influence Richard couldn't command. The hidden truth of the Collins household, its coldness, its imbalance, was no longer hidden. It stood in the middle of the table, undeniable. Ethan, still seated, leaned back in his chair, his small frame radiating a quiet resolve. He didn't realize it fully, but his decision had already transformed the evening. He had revealed a fracture in the very foundation of his father's authority, and though he was only a child, the impact of his words would linger long after the plates were cleared and the guests had gone. Richard forced a smile, a strained gesture that fooled no one. "Children," he said lightly, his voice trying to mask the storm brewing inside him, "they say the strangest things." The laughter that followed was awkward, hesitant, more an attempt to escape the tension than to embrace the joke. But Ethan's words couldn't be erased by forced levity. They had already etched themselves into the night. Mary, steadying her breath, lowered her tray and stepped back into the shadows. But her mind raced. She hadn't sought this confrontation, yet she could feel the journey turning, the narrative shifting. Ethan had given voice to something larger than both of them, the truth that no wealth or authority could replace the warmth of being heard, the dignity of being seen. The table resumed its rhythm, forks scraping plates, glasses clinking, but the atmosphere never recovered. Richard's guests might have pretended to move on, but deep inside they carried the revelation they had just witnessed, that power can be pierced not by rivals, but by the innocence of a child asking for a story. And in the silence between words, everyone sensed that this was not the end. It was the beginning of something that would change the Collins mansion forever. Mary stood very still, the tray balanced in her hands as if it might anchor her to the floor. The room was watching Richard, but Ethan's eyes were on her, and that was the gaze she answered. A small breath left her, so quiet that only she felt its tremor, and with it a decision formed, not out of defiance, but out of care. She set the tray on the sideboard, folded her hands to stop the tremble, and stepped just far enough from the shadows to be seen without taking anyone's place at the table. "If it's all right," she said, voice low, "I'll keep it short." No one granted permission, yet no one stopped her. In the hush that followed, the silence itself seemed to pull out a chair, and that chair belonged to her. She did not begin with grand gestures. "Once," she said, "there was a boy who had a coat that never fit." The sentence arrived like a match struck in a dark room, small, steady, impossible to ignore. Ethan leaned in first, then a cousin at the far end, and soon the guests who moments earlier had measured their laughter against Richard's cues found themselves measuring their breathing against Mary's pace. "He wore it because it was his only coat," she continued, "and because winter doesn't wait for you to afford what you need. He kept his hands in his pockets so the wind couldn't borrow them." The picture formed quickly, not a boardroom, not a marble foyer, but a sidewalk and a buoyant breath turning to fog. The shift was a quiet revelation. The room had been trained to admire success, but her story made them feel tenderness, and tenderness changes the angle of the light. "The boy had a route," Mary said, "past the bakery that gave him yesterday's bread, past the library where the heat always worked, past the church steps where people pretended not to see one another. He never asked for much. He asked for directions more than he asked for money. How far to warm, he used to say." She paused, letting the ache land without sentimentality. Ethan's fingers tightened around his napkin, a small signal that told her to keep going. From the head of the table, Richard's jaw set. Power doesn't like a room's gravity to shift, and yet here it was, shifting by inches with each careful image, each deliberate word. "One day," she said, "the boy found a door that had always been closed to him. Inside was a room like this, bright, careful, important. People were busy and he was in the way. He put his hands back in his two small pockets and backed up, but then an older woman saw him." Mary let the slightest warmth reach her tone. She did not scold him. She didn't tell him the rules first. She said, "You look cold." And the room measured her by that sentence. The door stayed open because that's what her sentence made it do. A guest touched his collar as if checking the temperature. The chandelier didn't glitter as sharply, it listened. "She found a better coat," Mary went on, "not because he had earned it, but because he needed it. When she gave it to him, he stood straighter, not tall, just less small. He didn't say thank you right away. He said, "Now I can open my hands." Mary's voice softened. Some kindness is not about gifts. It's about letting someone use themselves again. Respect does that. It lets a person keep their own name while you help them. Ethan whispered, barely a thread of sound. "That's brave." Mary heard him without looking, the way a lighthouse hears the sea. She kept the story's shoreline steady. "People in the room noticed," she said. Some felt the impulse to look away. Others felt the impulse to copy her. But the boy learned something that day about mindset. He learned that there are two kinds of rooms, the ones that make you smaller to keep their shape, and the ones that grow around you, like a jacket that fits. Mary did not say mansion or money or power. She did not need to. The subtext traveled like a current beneath the words. She allowed the guests to find their places inside the story, to feel the hidden truth without the embarrassment of being named directly. It was a strategic gentleness, the sort that opens locked elbows. "The next winter," she added, "the boy saw another kid with sleeves that didn't reach the wrist. He took off his gloves and gave them away. 'You'll need your hands,' he said. He could do that because he'd been given a coat. When respect lands on you, it doesn't stop. It travels." A murmur flickered and disappeared. Someone set a fork down carefully, as if sudden noise would break the delicate structure being built in the center of the table. Mary knew the stakes. Behind-the-scenes decisions are the ones that change families, not speeches from the head of the table. "The woman who saw him," she said, "never asked him to pretend he wasn't cold, and because she didn't, he was never ashamed of the truth. He didn't owe her silence in exchange for warmth. He owed her the kind of gratitude that shows up as better choices." She let the words fall into quiet. Even the air seemed to agree to stay still. Richard tried to interject, perhaps to reclaim tempo, but the moment wouldn't let him in. The room had re-centered itself, not around authority, but around attention. Mary did not stare him down. She simply refused the invitation to speed up. "There is a rule in stories," she said, "that the strongest person is the one who remembers everyone's hands." She glanced at Ethan then, allowing the line to land where it needed to land. He nodded, as if adding it to the small notes he kept near his lamp. From the end of the table, a relative ventured a question before she could stop herself. "What happened to the boy?" Mary tilted her head. "He kept walking," she answered. "That's all any of us do, really. But the walk was different. That coat wasn't just a coat. It was a map. It reminded him that respect is not a favor from those with more. It's a language everyone deserves to hear in their own voice." She took a breath that sounded almost like a promise. The woman kept the door open for others too. Each time she did, the room learned. Each time the room learned, the winter seemed less sure of itself. For the first time that evening, the tension began to loosen without collapsing into laughter or performance. One of Richard's colleagues, broad-shouldered, unaccustomed to smallness, watched his fingers as if noticing them for the first time. A cousin blinked faster than usual, blinking into place a memory she had kept behind efficiency. None of them would have called it a transformation, not yet. But something in their posture shifted, ever so slightly, from defense to reception. Mary let a thin slice of first-person truth enter, carefully, so it could bear weight without tilting the room. "I was that boy once," she said, not dramatically, just honestly. "I didn't have a coat that fit, and someone noticed. I didn't have to earn it. I only had to be cold." A quiet exhale passed around the table, the kind people make when they recognize a revelation that reorders their tidy shelves. "I can't pay her back," Mary added, eyes steady on no one and everyone. "But I can keep the door open. Sometimes keeping a door open is the whole story." Ethan pressed his palm flat to the table, as if steadying the earth. "I like this story," he said, small but certain. "I can feel it." Mary smiled without turning her head. "Stories that respect you let you keep feeling after they end," she replied. "They don't tell you what to be. They help you choose." Richard's throat worked. "Enough," he said, but the word lacked the iron it usually wore. It hung in the air, undecided. Power, meeting an unarmored narrative, struggles to find its familiar outline. He tried to relocate the moment back onto money, onto outcomes, onto the ledger where he felt fluent. "We're having dinner," he added, as if procedure could fix atmosphere. No one moved to applaud the remark. Mary didn't push. She never raised her voice. She set her hands lightly on the back of Ethan's chair, a gesture with the impact of a quiet signature, and offered the closing line the room had earned. "Kindness," she said, "is not the opposite of strength. It's how strength decides to show up." The sentence landed without sound, like snow thick enough to change a landscape by morning. Silence became her stage again, not empty but full, and in that fullness the room discovered how much attention can weigh when it is finally given to the right place. Ethan's eyes shone in the chandelier's mild scatter. "Can I say something?" he asked, and his father's nod arrived late, as if the permission had already been given by a different authority. "I want doors that stay open," Ethan said. "I want rooms that grow around people." A couple of guests looked down quickly, surprised by the clarity of a child's design. He didn't say Mary's name. He didn't need to. The blueprint sat in front of them, clean lines drawn in trust. From a corner of the table, the house manager, who rarely spoke in front of guests, swallowed and pressed his napkin to his mouth to hide how moved he was. The sensation in the room had become specific, not pity for Mary, not defiance against Richard, but respect. Respect as an atmosphere, as a decision that could be made in real time. The story had done its quiet work. It had offered a new mindset, without humiliating the old one, leaving space for those who needed to cross over. Mary stepped back then, returning to her post as if returning a borrowed item. The act itself carried a kind of grace. She wasn't interested in occupying the center. She cared about the temperature, about the way the room would remember itself when she was gone. Ethan followed her with his gaze, as though watching a lighthouse move, knowing, of course, that lighthouses don't move at all. They hold. Across from him, Richard reached for his glass, and his fingers hesitated. In that fraction of a second lay the hidden truth he wouldn't name. He had felt the story. It had threaded through the seams of his certainty and tugged, gently, unwelcome, undeniable. "What an unusual parable," one executive muttered, aiming for dismissive and landing on thoughtful. Another cleared his throat as if coming back from somewhere. A relative asked whether anyone would like coffee, a practical bridge thrown across an emotional river. They were trying to resume routine, but the routine had changed subtly. It now had to make room for the boy's request and the woman's narrative. Everyone sensed the impact, even if they lacked a label for it. Ethan reached for Mary's hand as she passed, just a brush of fingertips. "Thank you," he whispered. "I can open my hands too." She let the words rest against her like a small medal no one else could see. "You already are," she said softly. "You're building haven." He knew the reference and nodded, that tiny private city alive again between them. The meal continued outwardly, but the center had moved. Choices would be different later, small decisions in hallways and study rooms and car rides to school, because a story had dared to take up space. That's how transformation often enters a house, not as an announcement, but as an adjustment to how people look at each other. The guests might leave with the same coats they arrived in, but some would fasten the buttons more gently. A few would notice a child's question in their own kitchens and let it finish its sentence. And one man, seated at the head of the table, would discover that authority feels most brittle right after a true thing has been said out loud. Mary gathered plates with quiet efficiency, her steps even, her shoulders level. She did not perform modesty, she practiced it, which is different. Modesty that is practiced has edges, strong enough to hold the weight of revelation. As she reached for Ethan's glass, he said, "I want to remember this." And she answered, "You will, because it's yours." Across the table, Richard's mother-in-law watched the exchange and folded away a sigh she would unpack later when the house was dark. Outside, the Boston night had settled into its steady hum, traffic stitching together parts of the city that never meet at dinner. Inside, the hum was new, a softer current making its way beneath. the polished routine. The story had ended, but the room hadn't lowered its guard enough to relax. It had raised a different guard, the kind that protects tenderness from being laughed at. People spoke in lower voices, as if loudness might knock something delicate off a shelf. Richard lifted his chin, searching the table for a way to reassert familiar shape. He found none that didn't look smaller than the moment that had just occurred. His decision, when it came, was simply to proceed, to act as though nothing irrevocable had shifted. Yet the shift followed him, quiet and persistent, the way a new word follows you after you've learned its meaning. He reached for theatrics and found only routine. He reached for certainty and met the outline of a question. Ethan's plate was cleared last. Mary left a single slice of bread by his water, not because he needed it, but because rituals give the heart something to hold while it thinks. He tore it slowly, half distracted, half composing the next sentence he wanted to live. The chandelier resumed its glitter, but everyone knew it was only pretending to be in charge. And there, in the soft rearrangement of what a room could be, the night leaned toward what had to come next, as if the house itself understood that some reckonings do not happen in words, but in how people behave when the words are over. Richard lifted his glass to his lips, but the weight of it seemed heavier than usual. The crystal that once reflected his dominance now trembled in his grip, as though the glass itself resisted playing its part in his performance. The room had turned, quietly but undeniably, against him. Not in words, no guest dared speak, but in glances, in the subtle tilt of heads, in the uncomfortable way people adjusted their posture, as if they had just witnessed something far larger than a family disagreement. Authority is a fragile mask. Once cracked, everyone begins to see the face beneath. What Richard felt in that moment wasn't just irritation. It was shame. Shame because his son, the boy who should have been an extension of his legacy, had chosen a maid's voice over his own. Ethan hadn't shouted, hadn't rebelled with tantrums or defiance. Instead, his words had landed with a clarity that could not be dismissed. "I only want Mary's story." That sentence pierced Richard's armor deeper than any rival's insult, because it revealed a hidden truth he had spent years avoiding. His wealth commanded attention, but it could not command love. He looked at Ethan, expecting fear, maybe regret, but the boy's gaze held steady. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't rebellion, it was conviction. That subtle difference made Richard's authority feel brittle, exposed for what it truly was. A facade built on silence, not respect. A facade his son had just shattered in front of people whose opinions Richard prized more than his own peace. Around the table, the guests tried to resume their meal, but their faces betrayed them. One of the executives coughed lightly, his eyes darting toward Mary with something unspoken, almost like acknowledgement. A cousin shifted uncomfortably, her fork scraping against her plate, though she hadn't touched her food. Richard's mother-in-law glanced at him with an expression he despised. Not anger, not disappointment, but pity. That look said more than words. It told him the room no longer belonged to him. Mary, sensing the danger of humiliation sharpening into rage, lowered her gaze and tried to step back into the quiet anonymity she had mastered over the years. But even in her retreat, the memory of her story lingered in the air, like the aftertaste of something too strong to wash away. It wasn't just Ethan who had been moved. The room had felt it too, though no one dared admit it aloud. Respect had shifted its allegiance, and Richard felt the impact like a fracture under the surface. Inside his chest, anger and vulnerability wrestled for dominance. He wanted to scold Ethan, to snap at Mary, to reclaim the narrative that had slipped through his fingers. But he also knew, though he would never confess it, that raising his voice now would only confirm what everyone already suspected, that the great Richard Collins had been humbled by his own child. The authority he prized wasn't lost in silence, but in exposure, and the more he tried to mask it, the clearer it became. Ethan sat quietly, hands folded in his lap, as though unaware of the storm he had ignited. Yet the boy's calmness was the very fuel that fed Richard's shame. Her stories make me feel safe. Yours don't. The words repeated in Richard's mind like a sentence passed down by a judge. They were not meant as cruelty, but as truth. And truth is often more devastating than insult. For years, Richard had believed his wealth was a fortress, his authority an unshakable crown. But here was his son, tearing it down with a single choice, exposing the cracks in his carefully curated life. What use was money if it could not buy the warmth of a child's trust? What use was power if it collapsed in the presence of innocence? These were questions Richard would never ask aloud, but they pressed into him now, unrelenting. The guests exchanged fleeting looks, their silence louder than any conversation. They weren't just eating dinner anymore, they were witnesses to a revelation. Some glanced at Mary with newfound respect, others at Ethan with admiration, and a few at Richard with thinly veiled judgment. The hierarchy of the house had been rewritten in front of them, and no performance could undo it. Richard set his glass down too firmly, the thud echoing against the polished table. "Children," he said, forcing a thin smile, "say curious things." But the line fell flat. It was an attempt to laugh away what could not be erased, and the guests knew it. His voice, once commanding, now sounded rehearsed, even desperate. The authority that had filled the room only an hour ago was gone, replaced by a hollow echo of itself. Across the table, Ethan turned slightly toward Mary, a gesture so small, yet so powerful. It wasn't defiance, it was loyalty. And that loyalty, offered freely, humiliated Richard more than any open rebellion could, because loyalty cannot be bought, only earned. And his son had just shown everyone that Richard had failed to earn it. Mary, with her quiet grace, lifted a plate and retreated toward the kitchen, her movements calm, unhurried. She did not bask in the moment, did not flaunt the shift in power. Yet that restraint made her presence even stronger. In her silence, she carried the dignity Richard had tried to deny her, and Ethan, watching her leave, felt the weight of the moment settle into memory. Richard adjusted his tie, though it wasn't crooked. He cleared his throat, though he didn't need to. Every gesture was an attempt to rebuild the image that had just cracked. But no one was fooled. A man can hide many things behind wealth, but he cannot hide the look in his own. Child's eyes. That look had betrayed him, revealed the truth behind the performance, and left him exposed. The mansion, once his fortress, felt different now. The chandelier's glitter mocked him, reflecting not his triumph but his fragility. The walls seemed closer, the air thicker, and beneath it all a single realization grew. The story he had silenced had become the very story that undid him. He had tried to erase Mary's voice, but in doing so, he had only amplified it, first through his son, and now through the silence of everyone else. Dinner continued, but Richard barely tasted the food. Every bite carried the metallic sting of humiliation. Every glance reminded him of what he had lost. And though the evening wore on, he knew the weight of this moment would follow him long after the guests left, because shame doesn't leave with the crowd. It lingers in the quiet, waiting to be faced. And in that mansion on the edge of Boston, as glasses clinked without conviction and conversations struggled to regain rhythm, Richard sat at the head of his table, but no longer at the center of its power. Something had shifted, permanently, and as the night pressed forward, it became clear that the story wasn't over. The real impact was only beginning to unfold. The dining room tried to reset itself, as if routine could stitch over a tear that everyone had seen open. Plates were cleared, decanters passed, the kind of motions that usually keep a night moving forward. But momentum had shifted. Where Richard had once set the tempo, the room now breathed to a softer rhythm, one that had begun when Mary stepped out of the shadows with a story and a steady voice. The chandelier's light still fell in clean geometry across the table, yet the angles felt different, as though the brightness were no longer working for him, but illuminating something he hadn't meant to show. The revelation wasn't loud. It sat there, in the posture of his guests, in the quiet steadiness of his son. in the way. Mary's eyes stayed kind even after being told to shrink. Humiliation is a cold teacher, and it was still in the room, patient and unsentimental, while hearts recalibrated around a different kind of power. Mary didn't chase the moment. She returned to her work like a musician who understands that the last note only lives if you don't play over it. The story had ended, but its echo kept moving, through the careful clink of silver, through the hush that followed each sentence, through the private decisions people were making about who they wanted to be when they stood up from the table. She wiped a ring of condensation from the wood with the edge of a towel, the ordinary choreography of a life lived behind the scenes, and in that small gesture there was an unspoken moral. Love doesn't arrive with announcements, it shows up as care in the details. She hadn't said the words outright, but everyone had heard them. Ethan felt those words deeper than anyone. He slid off his chair without fanfare and crossed the small distance between his place and where Mary stood adjusting glasses. He didn't ask permission, didn't look for a nod from his father or a smile from a guest. He simply wrapped his arms around her waist and held on, like a boy anchoring himself to a truth. "You're the only one who makes me feel safe," he whispered into her sweater, the confession so soft it felt like he was returning something precious to its rightful owner. Mary's hands faltered for a heartbeat, then settled lightly across his shoulders. "I've got you," she said, tone barely above breath. The exchange was private, yet the room heard it anyway, the way one hears a bell through closed doors. Richard watched, and for once had nothing ready. Words, his usual instruments, refused to shape themselves into control. There was nothing to negotiate, no contract to lean on. What stood in front of him wasn't a challenge he could out-talk. It was a relationship that revealed the limits of his reach. Money had built the ceiling above his head and the table beneath his hands. It had arranged the guest list and curated the art on the walls, but it could not buy the simple way his son's body relaxed against Mary's side. He was forced, not by accusation, but by fact, to see the hidden truth that had always been there. Respect doesn't answer to authority, it answers to love. The guests tried not to stare, and yet their eyes kept drifting to the scene, a quiet center of gravity pulling at their attention. Someone reached for water and missed the glass, fingertips tapping the table before finding it. Someone else folded a napkin with more care than a napkin requires. Not one of them would remember the market analysis discussed an hour prior, but they would remember this image. A child seeking shelter against a woman their host had ordered into silence. The impact of that image would follow them out into the Boston night, into their cars, onto their phones, into the moments where they'd have to decide whether to speak to the next Mary in their own orbit or look past her like furniture. Mary eased the hug into a hold that a child could release without losing its meaning. "Do you want water?" she asked, a transition so ordinary it was almost a lullaby. Ethan nodded, still pressed close. "I want the cold kind," he added, "because children don't know how to be symbolic on purpose. They're just honest." Mary poured, then nudged the glass onto the table where his small hand would find it without letting go of her. "Thank you," he whispered, as if gratitude were the natural language of relief. The moral she had carried into the room, love and humility as instruments, not ornaments, didn't rest as a slogan. It moved into how she touched the glass, how he trusted his weight to her, how silence cooperated instead of accusing. Richard's mother-in-law, who had known colder rooms than this one and warmer kitchens than any of them, lowered her gaze. She had once believed that refinement could redeem hardness. Age had taught her that refinement without humility just polishes it. When she finally looked up, her expression held something like forgiveness for a mistake Richard hadn't admitted yet. He felt the look like a hand on his shoulder, not heavy, but unavoidable. "It's late," he managed, though the hour wasn't the point. He was trying to move time along, to outrun the scene, but the scene had already changed him, and change doesn't follow orders. "Dad," Ethan said, pulling back just enough to be heard, "can Mary say the last part again? The part about strength showing up?" Mary didn't move to comply. She glanced at Richard first, giving him a decision to make. This, too, was a form of respect, one that didn't surrender truth but invited him into it. He saw the invitation for what it was, and indecision pricked his pride. He could refuse and reclaim the stage, or he could allow and discover whether the ground would hold. A man who has always chosen control will often choose it again, reflexively, but reflex isn't destiny. Something about the way Ethan was standing, shoulders set, fear quiet, pushed at a door Richard kept locked. Mary spared him the performance of magnanimity. She shifted her gaze toward Ethan and gave him the line he had asked for, but softer, as though offering it for him to carry forward rather than placing it like a stone in the room. "Kindness isn't the opposite of strength," she repeated, more tender this time. "It's how strength decides to show up." Ethan nodded like someone memorizing coordinates. "That's the map," he said. "I knew it." The phrasing, unpolished, rang with certainty that adults often spend whole careers trying to imitate. The servers moved in to clear dessert plates, apologizing with eyes for the interruption, as if an ordinary task had become sacred by proximity. A cousin at the far end of the table made a small, unpracticed smile at Mary. It wasn't the smile of someone performing virtue. It was the awkward hello of someone who had finally seen her. An executive who negotiated billion-dollar contracts found himself wanting to say something decent and discovering he didn't have the vocabulary handy. "It was a good story," he muttered, then looked away, embarrassed by the size of his own admission. Richard reached for composure and came up with sincerity by accident. "Ethan," he said, and the boy turned, still holding Mary with one hand, as if testing whether love allowed for listening to someone else. "Yes?" His father swallowed. "You like her stories." It wasn't a question, but it wasn't a verdict either. "I do," Ethan answered. "They don't make me small." The sentence landed with surgical precision. Richard held it up to the light internally, the way he would inspect a clause that could change the outcome of a deal. The clause here was devastatingly simple. Authority that makes a child feel small is not authority. It's fear in a suit. Mary would not tilt the room into victory and defeat. She had learned long before this house that moral clarity without gentleness can harden into the very thing it opposes. "Everyone likes a story that fits," she said, offering both of them a way to stand closer without tripping over shame. Ethan squeezed her hand. "Like the coat," he said. "Like the coat," she agreed. The kitchen door swung softly on its hinge, the scent of coffee and cinnamon sliding out as if the house itself wanted to soothe what had been exposed. The staff moved with the competence of people who hold a family together without ever being framed in the family photos. Mary worked among them for a moment, refilling, resetting, grounding herself in the ritual that had always protected her from the sharp edges of days like this. But the ritual had new meaning now. She wasn't retreating into obscurity. She was carrying the atmosphere she had created back into the work that made it possible. Ethan sat again, one leg folded beneath him, his face flushed with the afterglow of courage. He looked at his father with an expression that carried no triumph, only hope. Children are generous that way. They keep setting the table for reconciliation even when adults show up late. "Dad," he said, cautious but open, "you can tell a story sometimes, too." The kindness of that offer nearly undid Richard. He had been braced for rejection, for the hard edge of a son pushed too far. Instead, he found a door he hadn't earned. "Maybe," he answered, voice lower than he intended. "Maybe I can listen first." The words arrived before his pride could strangle them, and once they were out, the room shifted again, just a degree, toward the possibility of repair. Mary did not meet the remark with praise or a lesson. She simply set a small dish of berries at Ethan's place and said, "These are the sweet kind." Ethan grinned. "I can tell." He ate slowly, unhurried now, as if sweetness needed to be treated like information, noticed, respected, saved. The Night's dramatic edge softened into a new contour, not resolution, not yet, but a contour that people could rest against without thinking loyalty required cruelty. The moral of Mary's story, the one she didn't deliver as a lecture, was now settled across the tablecloth like a second fabric. Love without humiliation, strength without spectacle, humility without apology. It presented itself in the choices that followed. A guest offered to help stack plates and then sat awkwardly when Mary thanked him, because generosity that enters late often fumbles its hands. Another guest asked Ethan what book he was reading and actually listened to his answer, instead of waiting for a turn to speak. Richard found his own hands on the table, still, as if he were waiting for permission to rejoin the moment. Permission, he was discovering, doesn't live in other people's eyes. It lives in the mindset you're willing to change. He knew there would be fallout. Power always calculates. Tomorrow would bring texts and carefully worded questions about the unusual atmosphere at dinner. Colleagues would test his composure the way a dentist taps a tooth. He could already hear the spin in his head, the decisions that might glue the mask back together. But another voice had begun to speak beneath the strategies. A less fluent voice, stubborn, human. It asked whether he was tired of performing a kind of strength that never let him hold anything tender for long. The question did not demand an answer. Tonight, it just sat there, faithful as weather. Ethan finished his berries and leaned again into Mary's side, less urgently now, more like someone choosing home from the available options. "I'm glad you told it," he murmured. "Me too," she said. It was the right room. The phrase did something to Richard he couldn't explain. He thought of all the rooms he had forced into shape, all the conversations he had driven like a plough through resistance, and then this room, rearranged by a story told at the speed of compassion. The difference was not subtle. It felt like the distance between being impressive and being trusted. Coffee arrived, cups set on saucers with quiet precision. Richard lifted one and found that his hands had stopped shaking. He looked at Mary and tried to nod in a way that didn't lean on rank. It was clumsy, but it was real. She returned the nod with a civility that left his dignity intact. "Mr. Collins," she said simply. The title wasn't submission. It was a boundary, kept kindly. A way to say we can meet here without pretending we're somewhere else. He recognized the gift and let it stand. The room exhaled, that strange collective breath people take when a scene has moved past the cliff where it could have broken. No one clapped. No one announced a lesson learned. The adjustment was quieter than that. It slid into how chairs were pushed back, how coats were lifted from their hooks, how parting words found warmth they hadn't carried on arrival. People left, telling themselves they had attended another Collins dinner, but they would wake the next morning with the story's cadence still in their ears, and they would make small, better decisions without connecting them to what they had witnessed. That is how transformation usually works when it's honest, slowly, in the muscles. When the last guest stepped into the cold, the house settled into the version of itself that only the family and the staff know. The aftermath is where character lives, and the mansion now held three different kinds of quiet. In one corner, relief, in another, fatigue, and at the head of the table, a silence that demanded Richard choose between the old narrative and a new one that frightened him because it required surrender. He stood alone for a moment, fingers grazing the back of the chair where Ethan had sat. "I don't know how to do this," he said under his breath, not intending anyone to hear, but someone did. Mary, returning with a cloth, paused. She didn't answer. "With a plan or a scripture?" "Most good things don't have a manual," she said gently. "They have a person." He looked up, the sentence landing in a part of him he'd boarded over. "And what does that person do?" he asked, surprised to find himself asking at all. Mary's reply was almost a smile. "They listen until the room grows around the truth." He had no defense ready for a line like that. He only nodded, awkward, grateful, unsettled. Upstairs, Ethan turned on the small lamp beside his bed and untucked a new scrap of paper under its base. He wrote 3 words with a tired, careful hand: "Open the door." He didn't need to explain it to himself. It was a note for tomorrow, for the next decision, for the next time a voice might tremble or a heart might hide. He slid under the covers and closed his eyes with the softness of someone finally warmed, holding the map Mary had named without naming. Downstairs, Richard stood in the doorway of the dining room and looked back. He saw the table that had always been his stage and realized it had become an audience. The humility he had mocked had not made him smaller. It had revealed the smallness of what he had been calling strength. There was no applause for this recognition, no lyric swell, just the honest weight of a new beginning pressing its palm against his chest. He felt it, resisted it, felt it again. Mary moved through the room, gathering what remained, not erasing the night, but respecting it. She lifted a stray napkin, straightened. A chair, by an inch, restored the ordinary, as if the ordinary had always been sacred. When she reached the doorway, she glanced back once, not for approval, not for victory, but to make sure the space was hospitable to whatever needed to happen next. The light pooled softly across the floor, a quiet path, and the house, no longer pretending not to hear itself, leaned into that path with the patience of a place willing to be remade by the very people it shelters. The house was quiet now, that kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty but full, as though the walls themselves were still processing what had happened. The guests were gone. The polished shoes had clicked down the steps and disappeared into the Boston night, and only the lingering echo of voices remained, some sharp, some tender, all changed by the story they had heard. Richard stood alone in the hallway, one hand resting against the panelled wood, as if steadying himself after a long performance. Yet what he felt was not exhaustion from entertaining, but from being exposed. For the first time in years, he was no longer the one who had shaped the evening. His son had, with a single request, shifted the entire axis of the night. Upstairs, Ethan had already fallen asleep, the lamp still glowing faintly against his drawings. He held his teddy bear under one arm, and on the small slip of paper tucked beneath the lamp were the words he had scribbled earlier. "Open the door." It was his private reminder, the kind of message children write without realizing they are authors of wisdom. To him, Mary's story wasn't just a story, it was a map, a compass that explained something about the world that even adults forgot. He had heard his father speak of success, of decisions, of market power, but none of those had made him feel safe. Mary had, with nothing more than her voice, and that was the hidden truth pressing against Richard's pride. He had invested in everything but the one currency that mattered most to his child: trust. He could negotiate million-dollar contracts, reshape landscapes of influence, but he couldn't command his son's affection. That revelation hurt more than any loss on Wall Street ever could. He found himself whispering in the empty room, "What good is gold if it buys silence instead of love?" The words startled him because they weren't polished, weren't meant for anyone else's ears. They were just raw, exposed, and true. Mary moved quietly through the dining room, gathering stray glasses, straightening napkins, making order from the remnants of a night that had broken open something far larger than a dinner routine. She did it with the same humility she always had, not pausing to savor the shift she had caused. For her, respect wasn't about winning a scene, it was about making a space where dignity could breathe. She didn't need applause to confirm what Ethan had already given her with his embrace, the assurance that her presence mattered, and that to her was enough. If you looked closely, the mansion itself seemed to have changed. The chandelier's light no longer glittered as a symbol of untouchable wealth, but glowed softer, as if reflecting the story it had illuminated earlier. The chairs, once symbols of hierarchy, now looked like simple seats where people had been forced to face themselves. Even the polished silver carried a different sheen, not of perfection, but of participation, in a moment when truth had dared to take its place at the table. Behind the siesta scenes, The staff exchanged glances that said everything without a word. They had witnessed a shift, one that could not be undone by routine. And isn't that how transformation often arrives? Not in the roar of applause or the grand decision, but in the quiet revelation that the values we've trusted no longer carry us forward. Richard had believed that control was his anchor, that silence was his proof of superiority. But what had happened tonight showed him something else. Silence can also be rebellion, a refusal to trust. And when his son broke that silence, not with anger but with a plea for a story, it wasn't just a child speaking, it was innocence revealing the cracks in arrogance. In a mansion filled with gold, Mary thought as she stacked the last of the dishes, the richest treasure turned out to be a voice that money tried to silence. She didn't say it aloud, but the sentiment filled the air. It was as if the house itself agreed, the echo of her earlier story still alive in the corners. The lesson was clear, and it wasn't written in contracts or engraved on brass plaques. It was carried in a boy's embrace, in the quiver of his whisper, in the way truth can stand unshaken when dressed in humility. Sometimes children remind us where true dignity and love are found. They aren't fooled by titles or bank accounts or polished reputations. They see past the armor adults wear and recognize who listens, who comforts, who makes them feel safe. Ethan had done exactly that. And in doing so, he had turned a grand dining room into a stage where arrogance collapsed under the weight of tenderness. Richard remained in the hallway, staring at the staircase, hearing the faint hum of his son's voice upstairs, and realizing that respect is not inherited by name or secured by fear. It's given freely by those who feel seen. His wealth could purchase obedience, but it could never buy the look in Ethan's eyes when he listened to Mary. That was the cost of arrogance, and the beginning of something he couldn't quite name yet, but that he knew he would never be able to ignore again. And so the night settled into its own kind of resolution, not the tidy ending of a story, but the quiet rearrangement of power and perspective. The guests would tell themselves it had been another elegant Collins dinner, but deep down, each of them carried the memory of a boy who chose a maid story over his father's pride. The impact of that choice stretched beyond the table, beyond the walls, into the decisions they would carry into their own lives. Because once you've seen dignity emerge from the margins, you can never unsee it. The mansion held its silence differently now. Not the silence of suppression, but the silence that comes after truth has been spoken. The kind of silence that listens, waits, and prepares for the next step in a journey no one had planned. And within that quiet, the story had left its mark, making room for what was yet to come. And if you've stayed with me all the way here, maybe this story touched something in you too. If it did, I'd love to know. Leave me a comment with the phrase, "I'm with you until the end," or even just share how this story made you feel. Your words are what keep this space alive. If the message resonated, don't forget to tap the like button. It's a simple gesture, but it helps these stories reach more people who, just like you, are searching for meaning in them. And if you want to keep walking through narratives like this one, where humility, dignity, and love take center stage, subscribing is the best way to stay close. And now, before you go, there's another story waiting for you. It's right here, and it connects beautifully with what you've just seen. Click and continue with me there. We'll keep this journey going together.